Alright, so this is going to be a pretty simple project, but I think it's useful because there's a lot of times when you need to notify a user of something, whether it's an error or just like a little info block, and you'll often see these toast notifications. So something that will pop up in, sometimes it's up in the corner here, sometimes it's down here, or you could put it in the middle, wherever you want really. And you can see that it actually disappears after a few seconds because you don't want them to just stay there. And we can have multiple notifications because maybe multiple things happened and then they all just go away after a certain amount of time. Now we're going to make it fun and just randomize the messages and the types. You'll see that some of them have different colors. So like green is success, red is error, purple is info. So we're going to randomize those, but I'm also going to show you how you can add a specific message and a specific type, and you could use this in like form validation or something like that. All right, so that's it. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so this is going to be a pretty quick project. We should be able to get it done in one video pretty quickly. So let's change the title here to toast notification, and then down here, the way this is going to work is we'll have a div with the ID of toasts, and I want to be able to have multiple toasts. So basically, one can show up and then another can show on top of it, another on top of it, and then they'll just disappear after whatever 3 seconds. So we'll have an ID of toasts, which we'll put right in the HTML, and then the divs with the class of toast like this will actually get inserted via JavaScript. But just for now, we'll go ahead and put some in here. So we'll say hello world, and we'll say toast number 2, and then I want a button, give it a class of btn, and then let's give this an ID of button and just say show notification. All right, so I mean, we're just going to have it so we click the button, it shows a random message, but of course you could do form validation or any kind of anytime you want to notify the user of something, you could use this. So let's do the styling. The font that we're going to use is Poppins, Florin Pop's favorite font, and then weight 200, 400. Let's add that here. And let's set a background color. So background color, we're going to set that to Rebecca Purple. And we can just leave the rest of this stuff in the body. And let's style the button. So we have a class of btn. I'm going to give it a background color of white and give it a color, whoops, that's fine. Give it a color of Rebecca Purple, and then let's give it a font family. We want to inherit Poppins, and then font weight is going to be bold, and padding I'm going to add 1 rem, and border radius, let's do 5 pixels, and let's get rid of the border, so border none. And cursor, we want that to be a pointer. And then for the outline here, let's get rid of that. So the button focus state, we're going to set the outline to none. And then in the active state, so when we click it, I just want it to scale down a little bit. So we'll set transform scale from 1 to 0.98. Okay, so there's our button, and then let's do the toast. So we have toast plural, which is the container, and we want this to display fixed down in the bottom corner, and then we want to style each toast. So let's start with the ID of toasts. Did I give it an ID or a class? Yeah, and I gave it an ID. I mean, you could use a class if you want, if you don't like styling with the ID. But I'm just going to use the ID here, and let's display. Let's first of all position it. So we'll position this to be fixed, and I want it in the bottom corner. So we'll say from the bottom 10 pixels, and from the right 10 pixels. And of course you could put this up, you could put them up at the top over here, wherever you want, but I'm going to put it in the bottom here. And then let's do display flex, and I don't want it to be a row, I do want them to be on top of each other, so we'll do flex direction column, and I want it aligned to the end, so we'll align items to flex end, and that should be good for the container. So now let's style each individual toast. So for that, let's set the background color to white, and we'll set the color to Rebecca purple, and the border radius to 5 pixels, and padding we're going to do 1 rem top and bottom, 2 rem left and right, and let's separate them out, so margin will be 0.5 rem. Alright, and obviously you can style these however you want, but I think that's alright. So now let's take these out of the HTML because these will be inserted with JavaScript. So basically you would have, you know, your web page or form, whatever it is, and then you'd have this just somewhere on the page so that your toast can display. And it's it's positioned fixed, so it's always going to be, you know, at the bottom corner or wherever you decide to put it. So in our script here, let's bring in the button so we can add an event listener on it. So button, set that to document.getElementById, and we gave that an ID of button. Let's also bring in the container or toasts. Okay, and then I'm just going to have an array of random messages here. So I'm just going to do message 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we don't have to do this. Whoops, I can't count. We don't have to do this. We could just have like an argument, a message passed in as an argument, but this just makes it a little bit more fun. So we have an array of just random messages. Now we want to take our button and we want to add an event listener. Listen for a click and run a function here, and let's call a function called create notification. And if you want to at any time pause the video and do this, try to do this yourself without any guidance, I would invite you to do that. So let's create notification. And inside here, let's just make sure this is working. So I'm just going to console log 1, 2, 3, and let's see, console good, so that we know that's working. Now in here we want to create the notification div, because remember it's going to be a div with the class of toast. So let's say const, we'll call this notif, set it to, on the document object, we have a method called createElement to create any kind of HTML element we want. We want this to be a div, and then we want to add a class to that. So let's say notif.classListAdd, and we're going to add toast, class of toast. We also need to decide what we want to put inside the div as the text, as the message. So we can say notif.inner text, and you could set this to anything you want. You could just put a string here, or you could have it come in as an argument. We're going to have a separate function called getRandomMessage, which I'll go outside of this function now and create. And this is pretty simple. So we have our array up here. So let's just return from this function messages, which is our array with a random index. So we can do 0, 1, whatever. So let's do math.floor to round down math.random. So that'll give us a random decimal. We want to multiply that by messages.length. So the however many elements or items are in the messages array. So that'll give us a random message. And then to put it into the DOM, we're going to take the container, take the container and let's append. Why is it doing that? Did I bring in the container? Oh, I called it toast. That's right. So toast, which is basically the toast container, we're going to append child, and we want to append into that the notification. All right, so if I save that and I come over here and I click, I see message 2, message 1, message 3. So it's just going to be random, and they just keep adding up. Now, obviously, you're not going to want that. You don't want them to stay there. There's a few things you could do. You could put like an X button so you can close it up, but we're just going to make it disappear after a certain amount of time. So after the toast is put into the DOM, we're going to run set timeout, which takes in a function, and we just want to remove it from the DOM completely. So we'll take our notification and .remove, we'll just remove it from the DOM. Now set timeout takes a second argument of the time that you want to wait until you run the function. So we're going to wait 300 milliseconds, which is 3 seconds. So if I save that and I click show notification a few times, after 3 seconds the first one goes, then the second, third. So even if there's a bunch of messages, they're all going to disappear, which is what we want. Now in reality, you're probably not going to do like a random message. You want a specific message when you call this function. So what we could do is pass in something like this. This is invalid data or something like that, and then we could pass in here as a parameter a message, and what we'll do is set that to null by default, so that down here in the inner text we can say if message, then show the message, else get a random message. So now if I click show notification, it's going to give us this is invalid data because that's what we passed in here. And you would probably, you would only call this once. And we could also, and I'm just kind of just winging it here. I didn't plan on doing this, but just to give you a better idea of how you would actually do this, because you wouldn't actually do random messages, I don't think. But we could do a type as well, like pass in a type, which we'll just set to null by default. And a type could be like a CSS class, so we could actually copy that down and let's say add. So we'll do, say if there's a type, then you add that type as a class, else then I guess set it to like info, and then we could go in our CSS and we could say toast.info. Actually, that should be a class. So toast info. Whoops. And we could take the color up here and I don't want to duplicate it. I want to bring it down into here. So that'll be the info, and then we'll take that. Let's do a success class and we'll make that green. And we could take this one here and call this error and make that red. So right now, if I save this, it's gonna be purple. It should have a class of info. But if I were to add in here a type of, let's say, success, now they're green. So we have the ability to do that. Another thing we could do is, just for fun, is have some random types, just like we did with the messages. So we'll say const types, and we'll set that to an array, and let's say info, success, and what was the other one? Error. And we could create a function just like this to get a random type, and just take from the types array a random item. Actually, one thing we want to do is make sure that when we get the types, we use the types length here, or else it's going to be, because there's more messages than types. And then where we have this ternary, where we're saying, if there's a type, then use that. If not, use info. Let's change info to get random type. Now at the moment we have this is invalid data and success passed in, which actually doesn't make sense. That should probably be error, because that's an error. But if we take out both of these and we just call create notification, then everything's random. So the message is random and the class or the type is also random. All right, so I mean, the random stuff is just for fun, but you can see how you would actually add this in your application if you wanted to add these little toast messages. Maybe you'd have some kind of form validation, and if the name isn't included or whatever, you could go ahead and run create notification with a specific type and message. All right, so that's it, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this little project, and we'll jump into the next one. All right, guys, so we're going to do quite a bit in this project. We're going to use the GitHub API to fetch users. We're going to be able to search for GitHub users to get some of their profile data and display it in a card. And we're also going to make a separate request to get the user's latest 5 repositories, or however many you want to add to the cards. So to give you an example here, I can search for a user. I'll go ahead and search for myself, and you'll see that my avatar pops up, my name, my bio, followers, following, my latest 5 repos. If I search for Florin Pop 17, you'll see it'll pull his up. So of course you can search for your own. And if I search for just something that isn't going to be a name, it'll say there's no profile with this username. So we'll do a little bit of error handling as well. So these are the docs for the GitHub REST API. This is the newer version of the docs, and you can basically see, how you can fetch users and what kind of data you get. And then the other thing we're going to do is use Axios instead of the fetch API. So Axios is a library. It's a promise-based HTTP client library for the browser and Node.js. So I prefer Axios personally when I do any kind of larger or medium-sized to larger projects. I'll use Axios. It has better features in my opinion. It's easier to use. The error handling is better, so I definitely prefer it. So I did want to add it to at least one of the projects in this course, and we'll be using it with async await, but I'll show you how to use it just with regular .then syntax as well. So that's what we'll be building, guys. Hopefully you enjoy this project. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so we're going to get started on our HTML, and most of the stuff that we're going to do right now, the card with the user info inside of it, that's going to ultimately come from JavaScript with the dynamic data from the API after we fetch it. But for now, I'm just going to type out the HTML, just hard code it, so we can at least see it and style it. All right, so for the title here, let's say GitHub profiles, and then down here, let's create a form, and this form is going to have a class of user form, and it's going to have an ID of form. We don't need an action. Okay, and then inside this form we're going to have a single input and give it an ID of search, and let's add a placeholder, and for the placeholder we'll say search a GitHub user. Okay, so if I save that, we have a input here, and I'm not going to put a submit button. We're just going to type the user in and hit enter. You can add a submit button if you want. And then let's go underneath the form, and we're going to use the HTML5 main tag and give this an ID of main. Now ultimately this is all we're going to have in our HTML. Whatever the card, the user profile card, is going to get inserted in here by the JavaScript. But like I said, for now we're just going to type it out so we can see it and style it. So we want a class of card, and in that class we'll have a div with an image inside with a class of avatar. And I'm just going to put a dummy image from the random user API. So we'll say HTTPS random user.me/API/portraits slash, and I'm just going to use men/30.jpg. And that should just give us a random user of some guy. Now under this div here, so card, we're going to use flexbox to align it. This will be the first flex item. And then we'll have another div with the class of user info with all the user's info, such as the username, which we'll put in an H2. For now, I'm just going to say John Doe. And then a bio, which right now I'll just do lorem 10, some dummy text in there. And then under the paragraph, under the bio, we want a UL. And let's do a list item. So this will be like the number of followers. We'll say 300 and then put some strong tags in and say followers. And I'm just going to copy that down twice. This one here is going to be following. Oops. So following, we'll say 100, and then this will be the number of repos, say 30 repos. And then under the UL, we'll have the actual repositories of the user. We're going to get the latest 5 repositories. So let's have an ID of repos here. And then each one is just going to be a link with the class of repos. And then the text, I'll just say repo 1. And we'll just do 3. And that's it for the HTML. So it's going to look like this so far. So let's start to style this. As far as I can make this smaller now. As far as the font goes, we're going to use a font called Poppins. So I'm going to just replace Roboto with Poppins, and the weight, let's do 200 and 400, and change the font family down here to Poppins. Okay, and then let's see, we're going to add a background color. Not Alice Blue. We want to use hexadecimal value 2A2 and then A72. So it's a dark blue. And then we'll make the color of the text white. All right, and then let's see, for this stuff, this is all good. Yeah, we'll just keep the rest of the body stuff here. So the user form, for that, I want to just set, I'm going to set a width of 100% so it goes all the way across its container. This is the form, not the input. And then I'm going to set a max width of 700 pixels. All right, and then for the input, let's say user form input. Let's set the width of that to be 100%, and we want to style this to look a lot better. I'm going to also display it as a block level element, and then let's set a background color to the input, and that's going to be 4C2-885, so like a purplish color. Let's take away the border, so we'll say border none. And let's set a border radius, and we'll do 10 pixels on that. Okay, let's make the color white, and let's make the let's give it some padding. So I'm going to use rem units here. So 1 rem, which is just a multiplier of the root HTML element, which by default is 16 pixels. So we're just saying padding 16 pixels right now. All right, and then I just want to add a margin bottom. For that, I'm going to use 2 rem, which in this case will be 32 pixels. And let's set the font family to inherit. And let's set the font size to be bigger than that. I'm just going to set it to 1 rem. And let's add a box shadow or a couple box shadows. And I'm just going to paste this in. Okay, so our first shadow here with the offsets, the blur, and the color, and then we have our second shadow here. All right, and then if I click inside of it, we get this outline, which I don't want to keep, so let's say user-form input and then :focus, and then we want to set the outline to none. All right, and let's also make the placeholder white. So if you want to change the color of a placeholder, we can say user form input and then colon placeholder. And let's say color, and we'll set that to hexadecimal triple B. So make it a little lighter. All right, now let's work on the card, which is around all of the rest of this. So class card. And for this, let's set a max width of 800 pixels. And we are going to make this responsive as well. And then the background color, let's set that to 4C2885. So it's the same as the input background. And let's set the border radius to 20 pixels. All right, and then let's add a box shadow for this as well. So I'm actually going to copy this. Okay, we're going to use the same box shadow as that. Good. And then after that, let's display everything as display this as a flex box. So the two items inside are the div with the image and then the user info div that has everything else in it. So I'm going to set padding on the card to 3 rem, and let's set margin to 0 top and bottom. Let's do 1.5 rem on the left and right. So that pushes it in a little bit. All right, so it doesn't go any further than that. And we will add a media query to kind of stack those rows, I'm sorry, those columns as well. But let's go ahead and work on the avatar. So we have a class of avatar. I want this to be rounded with a border, so we'll set the border radius to 50%. And then let's set the border. I'm going to give it a quite thick border, 10 pixels solid, and then the color will be 2A2A72. And let's give it a height of 150 pixels, and we'll do a width of 150 as well. And now we have the user info, which is all of this over here. So let's take the user info class, and I'm going to set the color of the text to triple E, and just add a little bit of margin left to bring it away from the image. So I'm going to use 2 rem units here, so push that away. The H2, so user info H2, we're going to get rid of any margin on the top, so margin top 0. And for the UL, I'm going to display flex, and this is this right here. So I'm going to display flex, and actually let's take away any bullet points. So list style type, we're going to set that to none, and then display flex, and we want to justify the content. So this is the horizontal spacing. We're going to set this space between the elements like that, and just get rid of any padding. And let's set a max width on this to 400 pixels. Now for the list items, so these right here, let's grab this and say for the LIs, I'm going to display flex, and also I want to just align items to center on the cross axis. And then for the strong tags, see how the number is right next to the text here. So let's grab, actually we'll just grab this and say for the strong tags, I'm going to set the font size to 0.9 rem. And then let's also move it over a bit. So the margin left, I'll use 0.5 rem. All right, so that looks good. Now the repos down here, obviously we need to style those. So let's take the class of repo. So all of those links have a class of repo. Let's get rid of the underline, so text decoration none. And let's set the color of these to white. And I'm also going to set a background color to 2A2, A72. Whoops. I don't know what happened there. And why isn't this working? Oh, yeah, these should be repo. All right. So we have our background color. Let's do font size. And font size I'm going to set to 0.7 rem. So make those smaller. And then let's add some padding. And you don't have to use rem units. We just wanted to kind of change things up a bit. So we're going to do 0.25 rem top and bottom, and then 0.5 rem left and right. Okay, and then let's set the margin. We'll set margin right to 0.5 rem. And let's do margin bottom 0.5 rem, just in case the repos go on to the next line. And I think that's it. Let's display as an inline block instead of inline. And ultimately you'll be able to click on these and go to the repos. But that's pretty much it. Now I do want to make this more responsive because, you know, if it's on really small screens, it's gonna look kind of weird. So I'm just going to add a media query here. So we'll say media with a max width of, I'm going to do 500 pixels. So if it's under 500 pixels, let's take the card, and it's displayed flex, but it's a flex row, meaning it goes horizontal. Let's change the flex direction to a column. If I do that, it's going to put the two elements, the two flex items on top of each other. And then let's just align to the middle, so we can align items to the center. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And the form, let's take the user form, and initially I think it has a max width of 800 pixels, so I'm going to set it a max width of 400 pixels. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. So now it is responsive. So in the next video, we obviously want to make this function so we can reach out to the GitHub API and fetch a user. And we're actually going to use Axios, which is an HTTP library, as opposed to using Fetch, which is built into the browser. Okay, so now we're going to get into the JavaScript and working with the GitHub API. And this is the docs right here. You don't have to go to this page, but I just want to show you, if we go down to endpoints available for GitHub apps, these are the different resources that are available. We want to deal with users and repos. So if I click on users, we can make a GET request to the API and then /users, which will give us a list, an array of users. We want to get a specific username based on what we type in the search. So this is the request we're going to make, and it gives us an example of a response that we get, which includes the login, which is the username, the ID, the avatar URL, if they have a blog URL, their name, company, email, the number of public repos, followers, following. So we have access to all this data. Now the other thing we want to do is get the user's repos. So we can do that if we look at repos, and there's a whole bunch of endpoints here, but if we go down to the very bottom, you'll see we can do get users / the username and then /repos. And then that will give us a response that looks like this. And it's an array of the user's repositories. And we can get the name. All we really need here is the name. And then we want to get the HTML URL, which will give us the link to the repository. All right, so those are the two endpoints that we're going to deal with. User / username, and then user / username / repos. Now there is a limit. If you don't use authentication with the GitHub API, you have a limit of a certain amount of requests per hour or something like that. So if you are to go into production, you probably want to look at authentication, but we're not going to get into that in this particular tutorial. Now the first thing that I want to do is be able to fetch a specific GitHub user from the API. Now we're going to be using Axios. So I'm going to go to cdnjs.com and search for Axios so that I can get that CDN link so that we can use the library. So you want this Axios min.js. I'm going to copy the script tag and put that right above my script.js in the index.html. Now we have access to the Axios object, and we can make GET requests. We can do axios.post. We can do put, which is usually like an update, and then delete if we want to delete. And then if you just do Axios like this and put the URL in here, that's going to be a GET request. It's the same as doing axios.get. I actually have a full crash course on Axios on my YouTube channel if you're interested in learning more about it. So first thing I'll do here is create a constant for the API URL. So basically the root GitHub URL. Actually, let's use single quotes. So HTTPS, and it's going to be api.github.com/users/. That's going to be the root, because we're going to make requests to this / and then the username, as well as /username and then the repos. All right, so that's our root URL. Now to use Axios, let's first just let's create a function called getUser, and this will take in a username that we want to get. And then to make the request, we can either say axios.get, or we can just do Axios, and that will default to get. And in here, I'm going to pass in the API URL, but I also want the username attached to that. So in this case, it's going to be this / and then whatever the username that's passed in. Now, this returns a promise, and ultimately I'm going to use async await, but just to show you without using async await, we can say .then, and we'll get data. Let's call this data. Actually, let's call this res for response. And we don't have to do this. We don't have to say res.json like we do with fetch. With fetch, we have to do that. Then we have to do another promise and get the data. Axios makes it easier because we don't need to do that. I just want to console log res and see what that gives us. And res.data should be the actual data. But I'll console log res first. Now, if something goes wrong, then we want to add .catch. When we have a promise, we can use a .catch if there's some kind of error. So let's pass in error here, and then we'll just go ahead and console log the error. All right, now I'm going to just call this function right here. Let's say getUser, and I'll pass in my GitHub username. And if we go over here and open the console, we get an object back, which has config, with just a whole bunch of stuff here. But what we're interested in, you can also see the headers, the request status, which is 200, status text, okay. But data is where the actual data is going to be, and you can see my GitHub data here. So if I console log res.data, that's going to give us just the object that we need. All right, so there's no need to add a second .then with Axios, which is one of the reasons why I prefer it. It also has more features. Now, if something goes wrong, this catch will fire off. Like if we do users W, which is not a valid endpoint, you'll see that now it's logging the error, which is request failed, the status code 404. Now, I want to use async await instead of using this .then .catch syntax. So what we'll do is just get rid of that. And our function has to be async, and then we'll be able to just create a variable here called res and set that to that, and then down here we should be able to just console log res.data. If I save that, we want to change this back. Let's see, we're getting undefined, and that's because I did not await the Axios request here. So we need to async await. And now you can see I get my profile data. We can take this a step further and not use res, and we can destructure, because res is an object that has a property of data, which is another object, and we can destructure that by just using curly braces and say we just want to take out data. And then down here, I can just log data. Now, what if there's an error? What if something goes wrong? How do we handle the catch? Because when we do a regular promise, we can do .catch. Well, there's a bunch of ways we can handle this. What I usually do is add a try catch. So we can just say try, and then if something goes wrong, we'll catch with an error. And let's take this and let's put this into the try block like that, and then if something goes wrong, then we'll console.log the error, or ERR, whatever you can put whatever you want here, error or ERR. So if I save that, we get the same result, and you'll see if I go up here and I change the URL, we're going to get the same thing that we would get from the catch, from the .catch from the promise, we'll get here. All right, hopefully that makes sense. And you can use this try catch with anything. You could use it with the fetch API, although error handling is a little more complicated with the fetch API, which is another reason that I like Axios better. But yeah, so you can use try catch in many different situations. Now, at the moment, I'm just hard coding my name in here, which I don't want to do. I want to get it from the form. And you could initially call a user and show the user, but we're not. We're just going to have the form. And then when we submit the form, it'll get the user. So let's go down here and let's take, actually we need to bring the form in. So let's go right here and say const form and set that to document.getElementById, and we have an ID of form. And then let's go down here and say form.addEventListener, and we're going to listen for a submit. You could do this on like a key down as well, but you would be making a request every time you do a key down. But yeah, let's do a submit with an arrow function with our event object, and we want to prevent the default behavior. So we want to do e.prevent default, or it's actually going to try to submit to a file. And then we'll put into a variable called user e.target.value. Actually, you know what? Let's bring in search. The input, we have an ID of search. So I'm going to bring that in here like that. And then, whoops, what did I just do? And then once we bring search in, we'll set this, instead of e.target, let's set it to the search value. So search.value like that. And then we want to make sure that there's a user. So we'll say if user, then let's call the getUser function and let's pass in here the user. And then I want to clear the search value. So we'll say search.value and set that to nothing. So let's save that and let's go over here. We're not going to see anything happen down here yet. We haven't done anything with the DOM, but it should at least console log the data. It should call this, get the search input value in here, make the request, and console log the data. So let's look for Florin Pop 17. And down here you can see that it's logging the data for Florin Pop. Okay, so now that we're actually able to, search for our user's data, in the next video we want to take this data, we want to insert it into the DOM. We're also going to have to make a separate request to get these repositories as well. Okay, so we'll start on that in the next video. Okay, so we're able to type in a user, get their profile data, and console log it, but we don't want to do that. We want to add it to this card right here. So what we'll do is create a new function. Let's go down here and let's say function, and we're going to call this create. Let's call it create user card. And it's going to take in a user. And we want to take, let's say const card HTML. So we're going to create a variable here called card HTML and set it to a set of backticks. And then I'm going to grab what we have in our HTML, this card. So this div right here, everything that's in main, I'm going to take that and cut that We don't actually need anything in here. We'll save. That's going to go away. And then in our script, in this variable right here, in this template literal, I'm going to just go ahead and let's go like that and paste that in. All right, so create user card. Right now it's just all static, content. But I'm going to go after the backtick here and take main. Actually, we need to bring main in, don't we? Yeah, so up here, let's go ahead and bring in, say, main, which has an ID of main. And then after the template literal, we'll say main.inner HTML equals main, what do I call it? A card HTML. So card HTML. And let's save that. And then once we make the request right here, so we get the data, and instead of console logging, let's call create user card, and let's pass in our data, which is the user data. And that gets passed in here. Right now it's going to be the same static content, but let's just make sure that that works at least. So if I type in Brad, enter. Okay, so we get a card, but it still has John Doe in it. So let's change this stuff up. We now have access to the user data. And if you want to see exactly what that gives you, we could take this and you could just go right in your browser here and paste that in and put any GitHub username, and you're going to see what it gives you. So you can see the avatar URL is what we want. That we're going to want the user name right here. We're going to want the bio. So all this data is available to you. So let's go to the image here. Let's get rid of that, and let's put in here the user.avatar_URL. And then for the alt, we'll go ahead and say user. Let's do the user name, and right here in the H2 we want to use user.name, and then the bio. Oops. So let's get rid of this and let's add user.bio. And then we have down here like our followers, so we'll get rid of this 300 here and let's put in user.followers. And then we have our following, user.following, and our repos is going to be user.public_repos. And this is all coming from the API. You can see right here, public repos. You have other stuff like public gists, company, blog you could use. And then repos here, we're just going to get rid of these because we're actually going to make another request to get those and then insert. But I'm just going to get rid of those for now. So let's save that and let's go back to our application here, and I'm going to search for my profile, and there we go. So we get my image, my name, my bio, number of followers, following. I should follow some more people. Repos. Good. Now we don't have the repos yet, like the because we're going to get the top 5 repos or the latest 5. We're going to do that in the next video. But what I do want to do is handle the error, because right now, if there's an error, like let's put something that we know is probably not a name, and nothing happens, well, something does happen. It console logs right here. So if there's an error, let's get rid of this and let's call a function called create error card. All right, now, well, we could do it this way. You can also check for specific responses, like that would be a 404 because it wouldn't be found. So we could do an if here, and we could say if the error dot response dot status is equal to a 404, then we want to do a create error card. And then you can check for other types of responses as well. But we'll just go ahead and leave it at this, because if it tries to find a user that doesn't exist, it's going to be a 404 status. So this create error card, let's actually, you know what, let's put a message in here. So create error card will take a message that says there is no, or we'll just say no user, no profile with this username. All right, so we'll go down here and let's create that function. So function create error card, which takes in a message. And we're just going to do the same thing we did above in the user card. We'll create a variable. We'll call this card HTML and set this to template literal. And we're going to have a div with the class of card, and inside this div we're just going to have an h1 with whatever that message is. Okay, and then we'll take the main element and set the inner HTML equal to the card HTML. So let's save that now, and I'm going to type something in here that is definitely not a name. And that didn't work. Let's see. Reference error, message is not defined. Oh, I put message, MSG. All right, let's try that again. So no profile with this username, and it's going to tell us down here that it got a 404 as well in the console. But good, that's what I want. So then we could try, like, you know, Florin Pop 17, and we get Florin's beautiful picture and profile. All right, so in the next video we want to work on the repositories. We want to show the top 5, not the top 5, the most recent 5 down here with a link to click on and visit those repositories. Okay, so now we want to add the repositories to the cards here. So I'm going to actually do another function where we make a request. So this is to get the username, right? Or I'm sorry, get the user by the username. Let's create a function right below it, and we'll call this one get repos, and that's going to take in username. And we're going to make this a sync so that we can use a sync await. And let's do pretty much, you know, the same thing here. We're going to use try catch. I'm going to just grab that and paste that in. Now for the error here, let's just replace the message here, and we'll say problem fetching repos. So if for some reason, you know, the repos can't be fetched, we'll just display that. We'll actually get rid of the 404 as well, just if anything goes wrong. Now here, we don't want to get just API URL username. We also want to get the repos. So I'm just going to concatenate here and add on to this /repos. Okay, so it's going to be the API URL, which is defined at the top, /username /repos. And I mean, I can show you that over here, what that would give us. So if we do, you know, users / and then Brad Traversy / repos, and that gives me an array of my repositories with the name, the full name, a bunch of info about the user or the owner, the HTML URL, which is a link to the repo. So that's what we get from that. Now over here, once we get, whoops, where are we? Right here. So once we get that, let's see, let's call, instead of create user card, let's change that to add, we'll say add repos to card. Okay, but we want to call this get repos up here after we call create user card. So after that, we'll say get repos, and we want to pass in the username here that is ultimately coming from here. Okay, so it'll create the user card and then call get repos, which fetches the repos, and then calls this add repos to card, which we're going to create right now. So let's go down below under create error card, and let's say function. We'll say function add repos to card, which is going to take in repos. Now we need the repos element, so let's say const repos element, and we're going to set that to document dot get element by ID, and we should have an ID of repos. Okay, if we look up here in the HTML that gets inserted, we have this div. That's where we want to insert it. So I'm grabbing that, and then let's take the repos that are passed in here and let's loop through them. So I'll just say repos dot for each, and say for each repo we want to then create our links, right? So we're going to say const, let's call this repo link, and set that to document dot create element, because that's what we want to do, is create a new element. It's going to be an A tag. We want to add the repo class to it, because if you remember when we hard coded it, they were links with the class of repo. So let's see, we'll take repo link, actually call this repo element, like that. So take the repo element and let's say class list dot add, and we're going to add the class of repo for each one. Now we want to add an href because we want it to point to the actual repository URL. So we'll take the repo element and say .href, and that's going to go to repo, which is the repository object, which has a value of HTML underscore URL, which you can see over here, this right here, HTML URL, which is a link to the actual repository. We're going to add that to the href of the link. I also want to add a target to this because I don't want it to open on the same page. So we'll take our repo element and let's set the target and set that to underscore blank so it opens in a new window. And then for the text inside the link, let's say repo element and set the inner text, and that's going to be the repo.name, which you can see we can get here. And then finally we need to insert it into the DOM, so we want to take our repos plural element and append child, and for each one of these we want to add the repo element. All right, so let's save that. Let's go back here, let's search for Florin Pop 17, and now you can see all these repos. Now I'm not sure if it shows all of them. No, it doesn't show, definitely doesn't show all of them, but it shows too many, right? So I want to cut this down a bit. Let's get 10 of them. So before we do the for each, let's take the repos array and let's slice. So we're just going to slice it from the first to 10. So we want the first 10, and if we save that and I search again, oops, I misspelled my own name. Okay, so now we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you can, of course, you can make that anything you want. All right, now the last thing I want to do is, instead of getting, you know, it's basically in alphabetical order here, and that's not what I want. I want the latest 5. So there's actually, with this API, we can add on a query string to, where is it? So right here where we're fetching our repos, we can add question mark, and we can do sort and set that to created. So now I'm going to save that and search, and now these are definitely my latest repos: the Curry website, Vanilla Node, REST API, React admin example, which are all YouTube videos, by the way. You can check my channel out for those. But yeah, so now it's giving us the latest 10 repos, and you can change it if you want to change it to 5. We could do that. And there we go. So now we get the latest 5. All right, so that's it. I mean, I know this is a small project, but there's quite a bit that we did here in terms of learning, you know, how to use Axios, how to use try catch and handle errors, you know, inserting things into the DOM and stuff like that, working with an API. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this project, and that's it. I'll see you in the next one.